Greetings. So we've gone over quite a few theories at this point, and we still have a bunch more to go. But one thing I thought I'd do is to just take a few minutes and bring in a topic that's interesting that we can begin to discuss with our theoretical perspectives, and that would be crime rates. It's always interesting where we see the annual results come out from the FBI or the Florida Department of Law Enforcement or whatever law enforcement agency is in your state or your city or your county that produces some statistics. And of course all the stats are supposed to go to the FBI and appear in the uniform crime reports, but also there's local statistics which are of interest and may be focused on specific areas not covered in the uniform crime reports. And we also have NIBRs, of course, to give us more details. But what's interesting is how I see it from reading the newspaper. When crime goes down, several groups, take responsibility for that. And when crime goes up, several groups are blamed for that. Or some groups are applauded when it goes down, some groups are blamed when it goes up. It could be the same group or groups. And I think that the realistic view of this is that there's multiple factors going on and interacting, and all these different groups play key roles. And a fascinating book is Bloomstein's and Wallman's book, The Crime Drop in America. Actually, this is an older edition. I believe they have a newer edition out. But it really, starts going over the trends and patterns, looking at different demographics, looking at the effects of the economy, of prison expansion, of the drug markets and of drug use, policing patterns, and so on. So there's really a lot of interesting features there. And what really, of course, gets me is that, when politicians argue, they will often, if someone's in office and crime has gone down, then the other person, opponent's not going to say, well, while you were in office, crime went down. What's up with that? No, if crime went up, they're going to say, look, you were in office, crime went up. What's up with that? And there's various responses to that, and sometimes it relates to funding, and sometimes is one tiny component of it, and of course demographics, community changes. But what I find is that trying to explain crime rate changes or crime rates or comparative analysis of crime rates, years ago, when I was presenting crime rates and I was looking at cities that had low crime rates and then cities that had real high crime rates, I noticed that the cities that had real high crime rates were, I don't know how to say this, but were interesting, fun, go-to cities where, you like to hang out and people vacation and all that versus some of the other cities. I mentioned actually one I'll never forget. I mentioned it in a face-to-face class, and one of the students in the class actually was from that city. I apologized, and she smiled, accepted my apology, but then agreed with me. It was a very, very boring city, but it had an extremely low crime rate. And of course, we run into that problem in Orlando here when we would see, for example, if tourists are victimized but they're not counted as part of the population, it can make the crime rate actually seem larger than in reality it would be if we just counted residents. So we have to separate those out. And there's a political nature to all that, but I often wonder what's going on driving those and the multiple factors. And I was interviewed back in 2005 by the Orlando Sentinel about crime. Most counties see drop in crime was the article, and what I said basically was, and to quote from that October 18th, 2005 Orlando Sentinel article written by Aaron Cox. University of Central Florida criminology professor Mark Winton said the increases could reflect the population jumps, not a greater frequency of crime. Whether the crime rate changes will depend on how these urban and suburban neighborhoods that are growing all over the place create a community that is cohesive or alienated, Winton said. A solid economy, increased cooperation among agencies, and a trend for law enforcement officials to continue education or enforcement education explain the crime's downward trend, Winton said. And really, I wasn't able to go into greater detail and start talking about drug use, abuse, drug markets, the economy, things of that nature. And then, I can reflect back what was driving my view and theoretically, and those key words, cohesion, alienation. So I kind of looked at, I kind of threw in a couple of terms we've already looked at, the solid economy, cooperation among different agencies, not just law enforcement, but mental health, school, and all these different agencies, and also more sophisticated technology, which I didn't throw in there either. And then, of course, I said law enforcement officials continuing their education, and some might say, well, that's obviously a self-serving statement that you're trying to recruit into your program, and I would simply say the research shows that officer education does have a positive effect in a variety of ways in understanding community crime patterns and trends, and also interacting with the community. So that's what the research showed. But if someone asked, was I trying to recruit, I certainly would say certainly, because it's helpful. And so other people had different ideas. And then, of course, they wonder, well, why? The sheriff of Seminole County said that, talked about the law enforcement really driving down the one of the lowest crime rates they had seen. And then the dean of the College of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Florida State said changes in social attitudes account for the report's rise in sex crimes, including rape and forcible sodomy. Women are realizing that if they stay in an abusive situation, they tend to accelerate, he said. Blomberg said the long-term downward trend in crime numbers reflects effective sentencing and rehabilitation programs that decrease the proportion of population who perceive their plight as hopeless and helpless. So then you see some of those things. And then to continue quoting, but Sergeant Barbara Jones of the Orlando Police Department said explanations to keep crime low are not simple. If we know why crime was up or down, trust me, we'd love it because we keep it down the lowest we can. And I would agree with that law enforcement officer, simply that there's just so many different factors that go into play. But really, we have a theory and theories that I might have a different theory related to domestic violence. Probably it's going to be more related from a gender feminist perspective, but I might have more of a biosocial model, for example, if we're talking about an increase in a particular drug addiction, and include that with the economy and other social factors. About 5 years ago, when I was teaching policy analysis face-to-face, I went in there into the class, and I was kind of in a mood, bad mood, because I was reading literature and everything, and I talked to my class, had discussion about how I thought there was going to be a huge opioid, crisis in the future, and presented the research, the trends, the patterns, what we're doing, what we're failing to do, and then, of course, 5 years later, we're stuck with this huge problem. And I don't, say, see, I told you so, because that's useless and doesn't help. What I'm thinking is, how could have I and others that are in the criminal justice research area have encouraged the policymakers to take a different approach. And it brings me no pleasure to say, see, I told you so, but it actually is very saddening in that sense that the policymakers took a route that myself and others thought would fail for sure, and it did. But there's still ways to get out of it, but that's kind of interesting too. Once I had my class years ago when I was teaching over in a sociology department, write to public officials and ask them what professional journals they read. And basically, to get credit, they had to just give me a copy of the letter and also that they had mailed it. And I think we got back out of about 30, 35 or something, we got back like 2 or 3 responses. And I think one said, doesn't have time to read any. Another said, aides read the stuff and then gives a short report. And then I think another person actually read some journals and was working on a master's degree. And it's just like, okay, what happened to the other, 30? And so, we often wonder, well, how does this get used? And how do we make that theoretical connection with what's going on in society and what we can do about it policy-wise? How do we make the connection with theory, research, and practice and policy, basically? That's why we have a lot of these courses, and they really should be coming together for you. Whether it's the theory class, the research methods, or stat class, for example, or a policy class you might take, or a law, social control, a policing class, a corrections class, and an organizational analysis, things of that nature, all kind of, everything comes together. And that's what I think is helpful as well. Anyway, I'll start wrapping up here, but I did want to mention, we're studying critical theorists right now, and this reminds me of a story that 2 critical criminologists are at a conference, and they decide to take a little break from all that research, and because they're at the beach, and so they go down to the beach, they get themselves some sodas and some chips, and they're relaxing, and they're talking about different research methods and different qualitative analysis software packages, and they're debating whether to use ANOVA or Wilcoxon test, and they're going on about all this stuff, and but they're critical criminologists. They have that critical view, and one has been in the academic setting for about 15 years, and the other one just got hired and everything. And finally, the older critical criminologist says to the younger one, "Hey, let's go get an ice cream." And the other one says, "Yeah, it's really hot out here, on the Fort Lauderdale beach, relaxing." So they go to get an ice cream. Well, they both stand up and start walking, and the older critical criminologist all of a sudden has a thought and looks at the younger one and says, "You have read Marx." And the younger one says, "Oh yes, it's from the beach chairs." All right, we'll be seeing another video next week. Thank